The drive up from Missoula took about 3 hours, give or take, depending on how long you spent second-guessing the turnoff past Seeley Lake. I spent a while. The road narrows down to something that feels more like a suggestion after you leave the pavement, and then it narrows again, and then you're grinding up switchbacks in a truck that's borrowed and not exactly young, watching the tree line drop away below you, and at some point you stop checking the mirror because there's nothing behind you worth looking at. That was the idea anyway. I'd found the listing in April, buried in a Forest Service volunteer page I'd gotten to through about 4 links from somewhere else entirely. 11 weeks, 7,705 feet. No cell service, no neighbors. The application asked if I had any experience with radio equipment, fire behavior, and wilderness first aid. I had some of each, not a lot of any, which I said. They took me anyway. I think they just needed someone willing to go. I'm not going to explain what I was getting away from. Not because it's dramatic, it isn't really, but because it doesn't matter to the story, and I never liked people who front-load their reasons like they're building a case. I wanted to be somewhere quiet. The mountain was quiet. That's enough. I got to the tower mid-afternoon on a Tuesday in late June. The access road put me out on bare granite about 200 yards from the base, and I walked the rest with the duffel over one shoulder and a paper grocery bag in the other arm. The ramen, some instant oatmeal, a jar of peanut butter, coffee, and 3 spiral-bound notebooks I'd grabbed off an end cap at the Walmart on North Reserve Street the morning I left. I don't know why 3. A habit, maybe, or some dim idea that I'd finally write something worth keeping if I had enough pages and no one around to interrupt. The tower itself is a cab on stilts. 60 steps of steel grating up to a 14 by 14 room with windows on all 4 sides and a catwalk running the perimeter. Standard Osborne firefinder in the middle of the room, mounted on a pivot with a topographic map under glass and a sighting alidade for triangulating smoke. The radio was a base unit bolted to the north wall, old but maintained, with a handset and a frequency dial and a log sheet on a clipboard beside it. There was a cot, a propane stove, a small table, and a shelf of reference materials, weather guides, fire behavior charts, a laminated protocol sheet for check-ins, and a manual for the radio equipment. I put the duffel on the cot and the groceries on the table and stood at the south window for a while. The Swan Range was out there to the east, and Daughter of the Sun Mountains sat in the middle distance doing whatever mountains do when nobody's watching them. The granite up here stays warm from the sun longer than you'd expect and then goes cold fast once the light drops. I could already feel it coming through the glass. The first check-in was at 6 in the evening. I'd been told what to expect. Dispatcher at the Seeley Lake District office, routine confirmation, nothing elaborate. The voice that came back was clear and even, a woman's voice. And she said her name was Madeline Solomon and asked if I'd arrived without incident. Arrived fine, I said. Road's rougher than the map suggested past the second switchback. It always is, she said. You'll have the morning check-in at 6. Call signs in the protocol sheet. That was about the whole of it. I wrote the time in the log and set the handset back in its cradle and made ramen on the propane stove and ate it standing at the north window, watching the light go out of the sky in stages. After I cleaned up, I sat on the cot and picked up the radio manual. I don't entirely know why. There wasn't much else to do, and I'd rather read something functional than nothing. It was a 1962 Motorola manual, the cover worn soft at the corners, the pages gone that particular yellow that paper gets when it's been sitting in a dry place for a long time. Most of it was typed, the font slightly uneven the way old typewriters go, with technical diagrams for the transmitter components and frequency charts and maintenance schedules. Standard stuff. The kind of thing you read not because you expect to need it, but because knowing how something works makes you feel less like a passenger. I got through most of it in an hour or so. Near the back, in the section on usable frequencies, there was a chart listing channel designations and their corresponding uses, emergency bands, coordination channels. weather service frequencies. Most entries had the same typed format. One didn't. Beside 162.475 MHz in the margin, someone had written in blue ballpoint, "Do not tune." Not typed, written by hand, and written hard, the kind of pressure you use when you want something to stay. I held the page up toward the lamp and could see the impression it had left in the page underneath, the letters pushed through like a second copy. I looked at it for a bit. There was no other annotation anywhere in the manual, nothing else handwritten, no other warnings or notes or names, just that. The ink was old enough that it didn't tell me much about when, and the handwriting was plain block letters that didn't tell me much about who. I thought, maintenance note maybe, some frequency that caused interference with other equipment, or a channel that was already spoken for by somebody else in the district. I thought, probably nothing. I thought, I'll ask Madeline in the morning if I remember. I didn't write it down. That's the thing I keep coming back to, not that it changed anything. But I didn't write it down. I just turned the page, finished the manual, set it back on the shelf, and went to sleep. The cot was narrow, and the sleeping bag was adequate, and the granite under the tower held its cold the way Madeline had probably known it would. The kind of cold that comes up through the floor and settles at ankle height. I pulled the bag tighter and lay there listening to nothing, which is its own kind of sound once you get used to it. Wind off the ridgeline, the tower shifting a little in it, the steel doing what steel does. I slept fine. I slept better than I had in months, actually. The handwritten warning sat in the closed manual on the shelf across the room, and I didn't think about it again until I had a reason to, which wasn't yet. The mountain was quiet. That was the whole point. I had everything I'd come for. 3 days in, I had the routine down cold. 6 a.m. check-in with Madeline, scan the ridgelines, log anything worth logging. Breakfast, usually whatever ramen I hadn't touched the night before, reheated on the emergency stove until it was hot enough to matter. Then the long middle hours of watching. The Osborne firefinder sat in the center of the cab like it owned the place, which I guess it did, a brass and steel instrument from some time in the 40s that still worked better than anything I'd brought with me. I'd gotten comfortable with it by day 2. You line up the crosshairs on a smoke column, read the azimuth off the ring, radio the coordinates to Madeline, and let the people with the helicopters figure out the rest. Simple. Mechanical. The kind of work that leaves your head quiet. The notebooks were filling up faster than I'd expected. That surprised me a little. I'd bought 3 of them thinking they'd last the whole 11 weeks, but I was already halfway through the first one and it was barely July. I don't know what I thought I'd write about. Smoke coordinates, maybe. Weather. But you get up there with nothing but your own company and it turns out you have more to say than you realized, even if the only audience is yourself, and a spiral binding. The bear entry was from that afternoon. I'd been doing a sweep of the tree line through the binoculars, just routine, and there it was, a black bear, a big one, maybe 300 pounds, standing at the edge of the firs where the granite started, not moving, just standing there with its head up, looking at the tower. I wrote it down the way I always wrote things down, which is to say all of it, every detail I could remember. The way the light was hitting the tree line at that angle you only get in late afternoon at altitude, the bear's posture, the fact that it stayed there for 2 full minutes before it turned and went back into the trees. I timed it on my watch. 2 minutes is a long time to stand still and look at something. I noted that too. I ate dinner, did the 6 p.m. check-in, and then there was nothing left to do but sit. That's the part people don't account for when they think about a job like this. The sitting. The Forest Service will tell you it's peaceful, and it is, mostly. But peaceful and easy aren't the same thing. By night 3, I'd already read everything I'd brought, which wasn't much. A field guide to Montana birds I'd grabbed from the free shelf at the library in Missoula. A paperback thriller I'd finished on the drive up, the Motorola manual, twice. So I was doing what I'd done the previous 2 nights, which was sitting in the observer's chair with the radio on the table beside me and just scanning. Not looking for anything, just moving through frequencies the way you flip channels when you're not really watching TV, more to have something to do with your hands than anything else. I don't remember what I was thinking about when I hit 162.475. Probably nothing. Probably the bear, or whether the weather front Madeline had mentioned was going to push in before morning, or whether the ramen I'd had for dinner was the last of the chicken flavor, or if I had another packet somewhere. The kind of thoughts you have when you're not really thinking. The voice came through clean. No static, no signal degradation, just a woman's voice, even and unhurried, reading aloud. I remember my thumb stopped on the tuner and I sat there trying to place it. Weather service, maybe. Or some automated broadcast I hadn't accounted for. I gave it 4 seconds before I understood what I was hearing. It was my bear entry. Word for word. The light on the tree line. The posture. The 2 full minutes. My phrasing, my specific phrasing, the way I'd written, looked up at the tower, the way something looks at a thing it's decided isn't a threat yet. That exact construction, which isn't a thing anyone else would write because it was a thought I'd had in the moment and written down, still warm from having it. I took my thumb off the tuner. The voice kept reading for another few seconds, finished the entry, and stopped. The frequency went quiet. Not static quiet. Just quiet. The way a room goes quiet after someone leaves it. I sat there a while. I'm not sure how long. Long enough for my coffee to go cold, which I only noticed when I picked up the mug and drank without thinking. The notebook was on the table to my left, open to the bare entry. I looked at it. I looked at the radio. I looked back at the notebook. The handwriting was mine. The words on the page and the words I'd just heard were the same words. I didn't touch the tuner again that night. I thought about the do not tune notation in the manual, the blue ballpoint pressed hard into the page, and I thought about how I'd registered it as a curiosity and moved on. I thought about a lot of things, none of them useful. Eventually I went to bed and lay there listening to the windwork at the tower's frame and did not sleep well, which was the first time since I'd arrived that I hadn't. At 6 a.m. I called in. Sealy Lake. This is Morell Mountain. Checking in. Over. Morell Mountain. Sealy Lake. Copy. How are conditions up there? Over. Madeline's voice, steady as always, the same mild Montana flatness she brought to every check-in like she was reading from a script she'd long since memorized. I gave her the weather report, the overnight temperature, nothing to flag. Then I said, I've got a question about equipment. The Motorola manual up here lists 162.475 as a National Weather Service frequency. I scanned past it last night. I want to know if it's active. A short pause, not a long one. Negative on that. That transmitter was decommissioned in August of 2013. The antenna's been out of service since then. It's sitting in the equipment shed on the south end of town. Why? Over. Picked up a broadcast on it last night. Probably bleed from another frequency. Just wanted to confirm. Over. Copy that. Nothing should be coming through on 162.475. If it persists, log it and I'll have someone look at the base unit. Anything else? Over. Negative. Morell Mountain out. I set the handset down. Probably bleed from another frequency. That's what I'd said, and Madeline had accepted it because it was a reasonable explanation. The kind of thing that happens with old equipment in mountain terrain where signals bounce off granite faces and do things they're not supposed to do. I'd said it because I needed to hear how it sounded out loud. It sounded fine. It sounded like a complete explanation. The problem was the words. Bleed from another frequency means you're picking up someone else's transmission. It doesn't mean you're picking up your own handwriting. There is no mechanism, none, not one, by which a radio frequency captures the specific contents of a spiral-bound notebook sitting on a table inside a fire tower and reads them back through a transmitter that hasn't had a working antenna in over a decade. I know how radio works. I'm not an engineer, but I understand the basics, and the basics do not include that. So I had the voice, which I'd heard, and I had Madeline's confirmation, which I'd asked for and gotten. The antenna was in a shed in Seeley Lake. The frequency was dead, and whatever I'd heard the night before had read me back my own afternoon, word for word, in a woman's even voice through a channel with no working source. I poured the rest of the cold coffee out the window and watched it disappear into the granite below. I didn't know what I had. I didn't know what it wanted. I knew I'd come up here for a job with no surprises, and that the mountain had apparently not gotten the same memo, and that the notebook was still open on the table to the bear entry, and that the words on the page were exactly the words I'd heard. I closed the notebook. I made fresh coffee. I sat down at the Osborne and watched the ridgelines. What else was I going to do? The test was my idea. That matters to me looking back. Nobody told me to do it. Nobody was there. It was just me and the notebooks and 4 days of sitting with something I couldn't explain. And at some point, the part of my brain that needs things to make sense got tired of waiting and started working the problem on its own. Here's what I knew by night 7. The frequency was dead. The antenna was in a shed. The voice had read my journal entry back to me through hardware that had no business transmitting anything. I'd confirmed all of that. What I hadn't done was test the boundaries of it, and the reason that mattered was simple. There's a difference between something strange and something that operates by rules. Strange things happen. Interference happens. People hear things that aren't there, especially alone at elevation with thin air and too much quiet. But if the frequency was operating by rules, then it could be tested. And if it could be tested, then whatever it was doing, it was real. Not real the way I wanted it to be real. Real the way a problem is real when it's sitting in front of you and you can't walk away from it. So I thought about what I'd written in the bear entry. Just observation. What I'd seen. Where I'd been standing. How long the bear had looked up at the tower before it moved off into the trees. Everything in that entry was true, which meant the voice could have been reading my actual afternoon back to me through some mechanism I didn't understand. Some sensor, some camera, something mounted on the granite below that I hadn't noticed when I climbed up. That felt like a stretch, but it was a possible stretch, and possible stretches bother me more than impossible ones, because possible stretches are the ones you have to actually eliminate. What I needed was something the frequency couldn't verify by watching me. I thought about it through the morning check-in, half listening to Madeline run through the weather outlook for the Seeley Lake District, something about a ridge of high pressure holding through the weekend and no significant lightning risk in the near term. I said the right things at the right times. She said to stay hydrated. I said I would. After I set the handset down, I sat for a while at the Osborne and looked at the South Ridge. It runs down from the summit in a long exposed line of rock and sparse timber. White bark pine mostly, wind-bent and stubborn, the kind of trees that look like they've been arguing with the weather for 100 years and expect to keep arguing for another 100. I'd glassed it maybe a dozen times since I arrived. Nothing on it. No game trails that I'd seen, no scat, no sign. Just rock and those twisted pines, and past them, a long drop into the drainage below. I went to the desk and opened the second notebook. I'd been rotating through them, not for any particular reason, just habit. And I wrote the entry. I wrote it the same way I wrote every entry. Same time of morning. Same handwriting, not that I was trying to mimic anything, it's just my handwriting. I wrote that I'd been glassing the South Ridge at around 9 in the morning and had picked up movement in the tree line just below the second switchback. I wrote that I'd held the binoculars on it for a minute before a mountain lion stepped out onto a flat section of granite, stood there for a moment, and then moved back into the trees heading south. I wrote that it was a large one, probably male, moving easy and unhurried the way they do when they're not hunting. I wrote that I'd noted the time and the location. None of that happened. I had not seen a mountain lion. I had not seen anything on the south ridge that morning except the pines. The entry was complete fiction, written in the same tone and format as every real entry I'd made since I arrived. I closed the notebook and went back to the Osborne and watched the ridge lines, same as always. What I was thinking, if I'm being honest about it, was that the test would probably come back negative. That seemed like the more likely outcome. I'd hear nothing on 162.475 that night, or I'd hear weather data, or I'd hear static, and whatever I'd experienced on night 3 would remain a weird, unexplained thing that I'd eventually file away in the category of stuff that happened once and never made sense. I've got a few of those. Most people do. The brain fills in gaps, and sometimes it fills them in wrong, and altitude does strange things to sleep, and I'd been alone for almost a week by that point with nothing but ridge lines and ramen and my own company. Oh, that was what I was thinking. I kept the radio on low volume that night, the way I'd started doing since night 3. Not loud enough to wake me if I drifted, but loud enough that I'd catch it if something came through. I'd been sleeping lighter anyway, not badly, just differently, the way you sleep when part of you is still listening. The voice came through at roughly the same time it had before, that same hour, somewhere between late and very early, when the granite outside had gone completely black and the only light in the cab was the faint glow off the radio dial. I was awake when it started. I don't know if I'd been asleep before that, or just lying still. By the time I registered what I was hearing, I was already sitting up. It read the Mountain Lion entry straight through. Same even tone. No hesitation, no inflection, no indication that what it was reading was anything other than a straightforward observation logged by a fire lookout on a Tuesday morning. The second switchback. The flat section of granite, large, probably male. Moving easy and unhurried, heading south. I sat there with my hands on my knees and let it finish. Here's the thing about a test. You design it, hoping it'll tell you something, but you also design it with the assumption that you'll be able to process whatever it tells you. That's the part I hadn't thought through. Because the result was immediate and it was clean, and it eliminated everything I'd been holding on to as a possible ordinary explanation. No camera gets a reading on a mountain lion that wasn't there. No sensor picks up movement that didn't happen. Whatever was on the other end of 162.475, Melwards had not been watching the South Ridge. It had been reading the page, the ink, the words I'd pressed into the paper with a ballpoint pen in a spiral-bound notebook inside a locked cab on a granite summit with no one else around. The mechanism wasn't surveillance. It was the handwriting itself. I got up and walked to the desk and opened the notebook to the Mountain Lion entry and looked at it for a while. The words sat there the way words do. Ordinary. My handwriting is nothing special. A little cramped, tilt slightly right, the kind of penmanship you get from someone who learned it young and then spent years writing fast. I've filled a lot of notebooks over the years. I don't think of writing as anything other than a way of getting information from my head onto a surface where I can look at it. The notebook didn't look different. That bothered me more than I expected, because here's what I'd worked out standing there in the dark with the radio gone quiet and the South Ridge invisible beyond the glass. I was the one holding the pen. Whatever the frequency was doing with the entries, whatever it was reading them for or reading them toward, I was the one producing them. The words didn't exist until I wrote them. The bear entry, the mountain lion entry, every observation I'd logged since I arrived. None of it existed anywhere except in my handwriting, in these notebooks, on this desk. I pulled the second notebook toward me and looked at the pages I hadn't filled yet. A lot of them. Weeks of them. I thought about that for a while. The shape of it was uncomfortable in a way I didn't have language for yet. Not exactly. But the shape was there. I'd come up here to watch the ridgelines. I'd been doing that. I'd been writing down what I saw, same as the job required. Something else was watching what I wrote. And I was the only one writing it. Night 14. I'd been sitting at the desk for maybe an hour. notebook open, pen in my hand, not writing anything, just looking out at the dark. The Swan Range was invisible past the glass, cloud cover, no moon, and the only thing I could see was my own reflection floating in the observation window, which I didn't love. I looked tired. I was tired. I'd been running the test results through my head for a week, and they kept coming out the same way, no matter how I arranged them. The frequency read what I wrote, not what I did, not what I saw, what I put down in ink. I'd been careful with the notebook since the mountain lion entry. Careful in a way I couldn't have explained to anyone, which is maybe why I hadn't tried. Every morning, check in with Madeline, same routine. Smoke report, weather, visibility over and out. She'd ask if anything needed attention. I'd say no. She'd sign off. I'd set the handset down and look at the notebooks and think about how many ways there were to describe what was happening up here. That would end with me getting pulled from the tower and somebody else coming up to take the position. Somebody who'd pick up the manual, read the warning, and either ignore it the same way I had or not. And either way, I'd never know what happened next. That's not a good reason to keep a secret, I know that. But it was the reason I had. So I sat there on night 14 with the pen in my hand, and I thought, all right, let's be honest about this, at least in here, at least on the page. Because the thing I'd been circling for a week without landing on was simple enough. When I finally set it straight, I knew what I should do. I knew what the right call was, the responsible call, the call that any reasonable person in a fire lookout tower with a functioning radio would make when they discovered something like this. You report it. That's the job. You report what you observe, and you let the people with more information and more authority figure out what it means. I wrote that down, one sentence, stated it plain. I intended to report the frequency to Madeline Solomon in the morning. Then I stopped. I held the pen over the page, and I didn't write anything for, I don't know, a while. Long enough that my hand got stiff. Long enough that the cloud cover shifted outside and I could see a strip of stars over the northwest ridge, and then the clouds closed again, and they were gone. Long enough for the decision to stop being a thought and become a real thing sitting there in the room with me, with weight to it, with consequences attached. Because here's what I kept coming back to. The mountain lion test had told me the frequency wasn't watching me. It was reading the ink, which meant, and I'd been trying not to think about this, I'd been very deliberately not following this particular thread all the way to the end, which meant the frequency would read whatever I wrote, including this, including right now, including whatever I put down next. So I wrote the second sentence. I wrote it slowly, which is not how I usually write. I'm not a slow writer. But I wrote this one like I was pressing each word into something that would hold the shape of it, which I guess I was. I wrote, unless the frequency read this back to me tonight, in which case I would never tell anyone. Then I put the pen down. I looked at what I'd written for a long time. 2 sentences. The first one was the responsible call, the right thing, the thing I'd already half decided to do. The second one was, I don't know what to call it exactly. A trap, yeah. A test, same as the mountain lion, but also a bargain. A real one. Structured so the frequency's own behavior would decide the outcome, which meant I was handing the decision to the thing I didn't understand, which is either very clever or very stupid, and I still haven't worked out which. The thing is, I meant it. That's what I keep coming back to when I think about night 14. I wasn't bluffing. If the frequency stayed silent, if it read that first sentence and just stopped, didn't read the second, didn't respond to the conditional, I was going to call Madeline at 6 in the morning, and I was going to tell her everything. The manual, the warning, the bear entry, the mountain lion, all of it. I'd already worked out roughly how the conversation would go, and it wasn't going to be comfortable, but I was going to do it. I closed the notebook and set it on the corner of the desk where I always left it. Went and made coffee on the camp stove, which takes a while at altitude because the water doesn't get hot enough, And you end up with something that's technically coffee, but only barely. Drank it standing at the observation window. Watch the dark. 2:17 in the morning. The radio crackled once. That dry static pop it made sometimes when the temperature dropped fast. And then the voice came through. Same even tone it always used. No different from the bear entry. No different from the mountain lion. Just a woman reading aloud, clear and unhurried, like she was reading to herself in a quiet room. She read the first sentence. She read the second sentence. She read the conditional, the threat, the silence it would buy. All of it, word for word, in the same order I'd written it, in the same measured cadence she'd used for every entry before this one. Then she stopped, and the frequency went to static, and the static faded out, and the tower was quiet. I was still standing at the window. I don't remember sitting down, but at some point I was in the chair, notebook in my lap, pen in my hand, not writing, just sitting. The coffee was on the floor next to the chair leg, and I don't remember putting it there either. Here's what I thought, sitting there. Not right away. Right away, I didn't think anything. I just sat. But after a while, when the thinking started back up, here's where it went. The frequency had accepted the bargain. I'd offered the silence, and it had taken it, which meant it had read the second sentence, which meant it understood the structure of the thing, which meant whatever was on the other end of that dead channel understood conditions and consequences and agreements made in ink in the middle of the night by a person sitting alone at altitude with no witnesses. And I'd made the promise, in writing, in the only medium it could read. That's when I stopped sleeping through the nights. Not that night specifically. I did sleep that night, eventually, a few hours before the 6 a.m. check-in, though I don't remember lying down. But after that, after night 14, I started keeping the notebook open on my lap through the dark hours. Not writing in it necessarily. Just keeping it there, pen uncapped, like that meant something, like I was holding up my end. The bargain was struck. Whatever came next, I'd agreed to face it without Madeline, without the Forest Service, without anyone. Just me and the notebooks and the voice on the dead frequency, and whatever it was going to do with the words I kept putting down. I'd come up here for solitude. I'd gotten it, just not the kind I'd planned on. Night 18 started like the ones before it. Notebook open on my lap, pen uncapped, the bass unit humming its low nothing on the desk. I'd gotten into a rhythm with the dark hours by then, not sleeping through them, but not exactly suffering through them either. More like waiting. That's the honest word for it. I was waiting, and I'd stopped pretending I was doing anything else. I'd written maybe 3 lines that evening, observations from the afternoon scan, cloud buildup over the Swan Range. Nothing that went anywhere. A pair of ravens working a thermal off the east face. Standard stuff. The kind of entries that filled pages without meaning much, which was fine. I'd figured out by then that the frequency read everything equally. The mundane and the strange in the same even tone. No preference, no editorial. So I kept writing because stopping felt like a different kind of problem. Stopping meant the pages went blank, and I didn't know what blank pages meant to whatever was on the other end of that dead channel. I wasn't ready to find out. The frequency came on around 2 in the morning. I'd gotten good at recognizing the shift. Not a sound exactly, more like the static reorganizing itself, finding a shape. Then the voice. I had the dial already on 162.475. I'd stopped pretending to scan other frequencies around night 16. She started reading. The entry she read wasn't mine. I knew that immediately. The way you know a room is wrong before you've identified what's been moved. The words were in my style, my cadence, the way I'd been writing for 18 days, but I hadn't written them. I was holding the notebook open on my lap, and I could see the last line I'd put down. Ravens, East Thermal, dispersed by 1700. And the voice was reading something else entirely. Lightning strike, northwest face of Daughter of the Sun Mountain, a bearing and a distance. Then a full grid coordinate, the kind you'd radio into dispatch, formatted exactly right. I know how to read a coordinate. 11 weeks at altitude, watching for smoke, you learn the language. This one was specific in the way real coordinates are specific, not approximate, not rounded. The kind of precision that comes from an actual event at an actual location. The date she read at the top of the entry was 4 days out. I sat there for a second, doing nothing, which is what I do when something gets past my processing. Just stop. Blank. Then I grabbed the pen and wrote the coordinate down in the current log. The real log, the one with today's date at the top. And I wrote the date from the future entry beside it in parentheses, so I'd know what I was looking at later, and I underlined it twice, which I never do. The voice finished and the static came back, and I sat there with the pen still in my hand, looking at what I'd written. A future entry, not a present one, not a past one, something that hadn't been written yet, that maybe hadn't happened yet, being read back through a transmitter that didn't exist from a journal I hadn't filled yet. The math of that sat in my chest like a swallowed stone. I turned the lamp off and watched the northwest face of Daughter of the Sun Mountain for the rest of the night. Nothing. Clear sky, stars, the kind of dark that has weight to it up at altitude. I watched it the next morning too, during the 6 a.m. check-in, while Madeline ran through her routine and I said everything was quiet and copied the coordinate onto a separate page so I'd have it in 2 places. I watched it through the afternoon of day 19 and the full span of day 20. The cloud patterns were wrong for lightning both days. I noted that and kept watching anyway. Night 21, the sky changed around 9 p.m. I'd seen enough weather roll through by then to read the buildup. The way the clouds stacked differently when there was real energy behind them. The pressure drop you feel in your ears before you consciously register it. I was already in the chair with the radio close when the storm came across the northwest face around 11. The strike hit at 11:40 p.m. I had the coordinate written on the page in front of me. I looked at it and looked at the fire starting on the slope, and they were the same place. I keyed the radio before the second thought arrived. Sealy Lake Dispatch, this is Morel Mountain Lookout. I have a spot fire, northwest face of Daughter of the Sun. Over. Madeline came back, steady and professional, the way she always did, no matter the hour, and I gave her the coordinates. The real ones, the ones from the future entry, the ones I'd been carrying in the log for 3 days, and she read them back to me, and I confirmed them, and that was it. The machinery took over. That's how it's supposed to work. The helicopter crew had it contained by 3:40 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was still in the chair when Crew Chief Zayden Fisher came over the radio to confirm. Morel Mountain, this is air crew. Fires contained. Good call on those coordinates. Over. Copy that, I said. Glad you got it. That was the whole conversation. Zayden Fisher was not a man who talked when the job was done. I respected that. I sat there after the radio went quiet and looked at the coordinate in the log and thought about what had just happened. Here's the thing I worked out sitting in that chair in the dark, and I want to be clear that I'm not a person who thinks in complicated frameworks. I'm a person who watches ridgelines and writes in notebooks and makes ramen on a camp stove. But I worked this out, and I think I worked it out right. The frequency hadn't predicted the fire the way a warning predicts a thing. It hadn't told me, watch out, fire coming, be ready. It had read me a completed log entry, formatted correctly, dated correctly, written in my hand, describing a fire that I then reported using the exact coordinates from that entry. The fire got contained because I called it in. I called it in because I had the coordinate. I had the coordinate because the frequency read me an entry I hadn't written yet. But the entry described me doing my job. Watching for smoke, radioing dispatch. The entry needed a lookout with a radio and a log, and I was already in position. I was already the instrument the entry required to become real. The frequency hadn't warned me about the fire. It had used me to report it, because reporting it was the only way the entry could mean anything. I turned that over for a while. The ravens were back on the thermal off the east face, or different ravens, I couldn't tell. The sky was going gray at the edges. Then I remembered the other entry, the one the frequency had read 2 nights before the fire entry. I'd been so fixed on the coordinates on watching the northwest face that I'd pushed it to the back of the log and mostly left it there. But sitting in the chair after Zayden Fisher signed off, it came back to me in full. That entry had been dated further out. The voice had read it in the same tone she used for everything. The bear, the mountain lion, the 2-sentence trap, the fire coordinates. No change in register, no hesitation, just words in sequence. And the words had described me climbing down from the tower at 3 a.m, walking north into the tree line, not returning. I sat with that for a long time. The gray at the edges of the sky went pink and then pale, and the ravens worked their thermal, and I sat in the chair with the radio on the desk and the notebook open on my lap and the log in front of me showing a coordinate that had just been exactly right. And I thought about the mechanism, about being the instrument, about what the entry required in order to become real. It required me to climb down at 3 a.m. It required me to walk north. The frequency didn't need to force anything. It just needed the entry to exist, and the right person in position, and the rest would follow. That's what the fire had shown me. That's what the fire had been for. I closed the notebook. First time I'd closed it voluntarily in 4 nights. The thing about understanding something clearly is that it doesn't actually help. I'd spent 3 weeks not understanding it, and that had been terrifying in a particular way, the way you're scared of something you can't see the shape of. Now I understood it, and that was worse. The shape was right there. Walk north at 3 a.m, don't come back. Clear as anything. I sat in the chair for maybe 10 minutes after I'd worked it through. The pink had gone out of the sky. The ravens were gone. Just gray light coming up over the Swan Range, and the radio on the desk and the notebook open on my lap, and my hands sitting there like they belonged to somebody else. The mechanism. That's what I kept coming back to. The fire had worked because the entry needed an instrument, and I was already holding the radio, already had the job, already knew Madeline Solomon's frequency by heart. I hadn't chosen to report the fire. I'd been positioned to. There was a difference, and I understood the difference completely, which is how I knew that the next entry worked the same way. It didn't need to force me down the ladder. It just needed me to be in the tower, alone, at 3 a.m, with the entry already written and the logic already running. The frequency didn't have a will. I don't think it did. It was more like a current. It ran along whatever path was open, and I was an open path, and that was the whole problem. I looked at the emergency radio. It was a hand crank unit, maybe 20 years old, the kind of thing you'd find in a surplus catalog between the foil blankets and the signal mirrors, sat on the shelf above the base unit, where it had probably sat for 10 years without being touched. The Forest Service put them in all the backcountry posts, independent of the main system, independent of the power supply, meant for exactly the kind of situation where the base unit failed and you needed to reach somebody. I had never touched it in 21 days. I picked it up. It was heavier than I expected. I don't know why I expected it to be light. I walked out to the observation deck with it in both hands, the morning cold coming off the granite and the catwalk metal, and I stood at the railing and looked north into the tree line, and then I didn't look at the tree line anymore. I looked at the railing, iron, painted black, paint chipped off in long strips where weather had gotten under it over the years. I adjusted my grip on the radio. The first swing cracked the casing on the left side. I felt it more than heard it. A sharp give. Something inside shifting. I swung it again, and the casing split along the seam, and the handle came half loose, and I swung it a third time, and the internal mechanism came out in pieces across the catwalk, small components I couldn't have named if I'd tried, springs and contacts and a circuit board that skidded under the railing and dropped off the edge. I stood there with the broken shell in my hands and the pieces scattered around my boots. and I set the shell down against the railing. I went back inside. The notebook was still open on the chair where I'd left it. 39 pages of handwriting. I'd counted once, around night 15, just to have a number, the way you count things when you're not sleeping enough. The bear. The mountain lion that didn't exist. The two sentences I'd written as a trap and a bargain, and both at once. The coordinates I'd copied out of the future. 39 pages of the only thing the frequency could use. I opened the emergency stove. It was a small cast iron box mounted to the wall, meant for heat in the early season and late season when the nights dropped hard, and it had a good draw on it. I'd used it twice. I tore the first page out of the notebook. The bear entry, day 1, the first thing the frequency had ever read back to me. And I held it over the open door and let it catch, and then I fed it in. I'm not going to pretend I felt nothing. I'd been writing in those notebooks since I was 19. 3 notebooks a summer, every summer, different towers, different ridgelines, same habit. The notebooks I'd burned before this were full of things I'd chosen to burn. These pages I was burning because I had to, which is a different thing, and I knew it was a different thing, and I fed the next page in anyway. The mountain lion entry went fast. Dry paper, dry ink, clean flame. I watched it go to ash and thought about the fact that the mountain lion had never existed, and now the record of its non-existence was also gone. And that seemed about right. The 2-sentence page I held for a second longer than the others. The conditional promise. Unless the frequency read this back to me tonight, in which case I would never tell anyone. I had written that. I had meant it when I wrote it, or I'd meant it enough, which is usually how promises work. The frequency had accepted it, and now I was burning the ink, which felt like something, though I couldn't have said what exactly. Not like breaking a promise. More like the promise had been made in a specific medium, to a specific thing, and I was removing the medium because the medium was going to kill me. I fed it in. The pages after that went steadily. I didn't rush. I tore each one out clean and fed it in and watched it catch and move to the next one. The coordinates from the future fire entry. The log notes from nights 12 through 15 when I'd been trying to figure out if there was a pattern. A paragraph about the quality of light on the northwest face at dusk, which had nothing to do with any of it but was still part of the same notebook, and I wasn't leaving any of it. Ash on top of ash. Somewhere around page 32 or 33, the frequency went quiet. I know that sounds like I should have felt something dramatic about that. I didn't. Or I noticed it the way you notice when a sound you'd stopped consciously hearing stops entirely, and the absence is louder than the sound was. The bass unit was still on. The frequency was still set to 162.475. I checked. The needle was right there, just nothing coming through. I stood in front of the radio for a moment, and then I went back to the stove. The last 6 pages went in one at a time. The final page was a note I'd written on night 20 about the ravens. Nothing significant, just that there were 3 of them working a thermal off the south face, and one of them kept losing the column and having to find it again. I'd liked watching that. I fed the page in and watched it burn down to nothing, and closed the stove door. The ash sat in there behind the iron. The notebook covers, cardboard, spiral bound. I'd burned with the pages, so there was nothing left on the desk. The pen was still there. I put it in my pocket. I don't know why. I went back out to the observation deck. The pieces of the emergency radio were still scattered across the catwalk, small components catching the morning light. The casing was against the railing where I'd set it. I looked north at the tree line. The entry describing that walk had been on page 27. I remembered the page number because I'd read it 3 times before I understood what I was reading. Page 27 was ash now. The entry was gone. The frequency had nothing left to read, and the silence on 162.475 was the cleanest thing I'd heard in 21 days. I sat down on the catwalk with my back against the railing and the scattered pieces of the radio around me, and I looked at the sky. which was fully light now, pale blue going deep at the edges, and I thought, that cost something. I knew what it cost. The lookout position, almost certainly. A fine for the equipment, probably. 6 weeks of nobody watching these ridgelines for smoke. I'd known all of that when I picked up the radio, and I'd swung it anyway because the alternative had already been written down and I'd just burned the page, and that was the end of it. The silence held. The 6 a.m. check-in came and went, and I didn't make it. I knew I wouldn't. The base unit was the only transmitter still functional in that tower, and the base unit couldn't reach Madeline Solomon without the hand-crank emergency radio as backup. That's not how it worked, actually. The base unit could transmit fine on its own, but I sat on the catwalk with the pieces of the emergency radio scattered around me, and I didn't go inside to use it. That's the honest version. I could have made the check-in. I just didn't move. I'm not sure how long I sat out there before I understood I wasn't going to. The sky had gone from pale to full blue, and the granite was starting to warm under me, and I was watching the tree line north of the tower the way you watch something you've already decided to stop watching, out of habit, not intention. The entry describing that walk was ash in the stove. I knew that. I'd fed the page in myself, and watched the edge catch and curl and go black. But knowing a thing and being done with it are different, and I wasn't done yet. So I sat. The pieces of the radio caught the light around me. Small components, a spring, part of the speaker housing. I'd hit the railing hard enough to scatter them pretty wide across the catwalk, and I hadn't picked any of it up. Didn't see the point. Somewhere around what I guessed was mid-morning, I went inside and drank water and looked at the desk where the notebooks had been. There was nothing there. Just the desk surface, a ring from a coffee cup I'd set down weeks ago, a crease in the wood where I'd pressed too hard with a pen once. I'd bought 3 notebooks at the Walmart on North Reserve Street in Missoula. I'd used 1.5 of them. The rest of that second one and the whole third notebook, still blank, had gone into the stove with everything else. I hadn't thought about that until I was standing there looking at the desk, burning the blank pages. That felt like something, though I couldn't tell you what exactly. I didn't sleep. I knew I wasn't going to sleep, so I stopped trying around the second night and just sat in the observation chair and watched the ridgelines the way I was supposed to. That was still my job, technically, until someone came up here and told me otherwise. No smoke. Clear skies. The northwest face of Daughter of the Sun Mountain sat quiet in the distance. No sign of what had happened there 3 nights ago. From up here you couldn't see the burn scar yet. Maybe you could from the air. 61 hours, Spencer told me later. That's how long it had been since my last check-in when he reached the tower. I didn't have a number for it at the time. It felt like a continuous thing, not something you could divide into hours. I heard the truck before I saw it. The road up to Morell Mountain is a long one, and sound carries differently up high. You get the engine noise bouncing off the granite well before anything comes into view. This low grinding quality as the transmission works through the switchbacks. I was on the catwalk when I heard it. I stayed there. Spencer Davenport came up the tower stairs with the particular unhurried quality he had, which I'd learned later was just how he moved through everything, not a performance of calm, but the real thing. He was in his green jacket, Forest Service patches on both shoulders, and he came through the hatch onto the catwalk and looked at me, and then looked at the pieces of the emergency radio spread across the deck and didn't say anything for a moment. "Ross?" he said. "Davenport," I said, because I'd seen his name on the duty roster Madeline had mentioned once. He looked at me the way people look at someone they're trying to assess without being obvious about it, taking in the eyes, the hands, checking for the specific kind of wrong that requires immediate action versus the kind that just requires a drive back to town. I must have looked bad. 61 hours without sleep does particular things to the eyes, and I could feel it, that dry, burning quality that doesn't go away when you blink. "You eat anything?" he said. "Some." He nodded at the radio pieces. That happened during the storm. There hadn't been a storm. He knew that, and I knew he knew that. It wasn't really a question. It was an opening, a door he was holding ajar in case I wanted to walk through it. I didn't. Equipment failure, I said. He looked at me for another second. Then he looked at the stove through the open door, at the ash layer visible in the firebox, and back at me. He didn't ask about the ash. He didn't ask about the notebooks that weren't on the desk. He was good at his job in a specific way, the kind of good that knows when not to push. "Let's get your gear," he said. I packed what was left, which wasn't much. The duffel, some food I hadn't eaten, the equipment manual with the handwritten warning on the frequency page. I thought about leaving the manual, and then I took it. I don't know why. It wasn't going to help me explain anything. Spencer did a walkthrough of the tower before we left. Standard procedure, I assumed. Checking the base unit, the log, the condition of the structure. He spent a moment at the desk where the notebooks had been. He didn't say anything about it. He wrote something in his own notebook, small and quick, and then he said he was ready when I was. We carried the pieces of the emergency radio down in a canvas bag Spencer had brought up with him. His idea, not mine. I hadn't thought about what to do with the pieces. He gathered them off the catwalk without comment, methodical about it, getting the small components along the railing edge, and put them in the bag and tied it off, and that was that. The drive down took 40 minutes. The road was rough in the upper section, loose rock and ruts from spring runoff, and Spencer drove it carefully without being slow about it. I watched the trees through the passenger window. Lodgepole pine mostly, then some larch lower down where the soil changed. I knew the names because I'd had 11 weeks to learn them, or was supposed to. I'd had 3 weeks instead. Spencer didn't ask me questions on the drive. He made one radio call to Madeline Solomon, short, professional, just confirming he had me and was heading back. And I heard her voice come through the truck's radio, and it sounded completely normal. That dispatcher's cadence I'd been listening to twice a day for 3 weeks, and something about hearing it in this context, in a moving truck instead of through the tower's base unit, made the whole thing feel more finished than it had before, like a door closing that had been open a long time. "She was worried," Spencer said after the call. "I know," I said. He nodded and didn't push it further. The pavement started about 12 miles out from Seeley Lake. I felt it before I saw it. The road smoothing out under the tires, the vibration changing quality. That particular sound of asphalt after a long stretch of gravel. I looked back through the rear window at the Swan Range going away behind us. The peaks were clear in the late afternoon light, sharp-edged against the sky, and I could see the general direction of Morell Mountain, though not the tower itself, which was too small and too far. I thought about the 6 weeks of fire season left with nobody up there, the ridgeline sitting unobserved, lightning finding dry slopes with no one to call coordinates in. I'd known that was the cost when I picked up the radio, and I'd swung it anyway, and I still thought it was the right call. And I also knew that if a fire started up there in the next 6 weeks and spread before anyone saw it, I'd know what I'd traded. Both things were true, and I wasn't going to resolve them into one clean feeling, so I stopped trying. The Forest Service opened the equipment damage investigation that same afternoon. Spencer told me on the way in, matter of fact about it. The way you tell someone about a process that's already in motion and doesn't require their input to proceed. There'd be a federal investigator. Taylor Ryan, he said. I'd need to give a statement about the equipment. I said I understood. There wasn't anything else to say. Taylor Ryan would have his questions and his forms and his expectation that evidence and testimony lined up into something that made sense, and I would sit across from him and give him what I could, which was, the emergency radio sustained damage and could not be repaired on site, and I missed the check-in as a result. That was all true. It was just not all of it. The two-sentence bargain I'd written on night 14 had burned in the stove on night 21, along with everything else. I'd written it. The frequency had read it back. I'd made the promise. Then I'd burned the page. You could argue that burning the page voided the terms, that a promise written in ink that no longer exists is no longer binding. I'd thought about that up in the tower, in the hours after the fire. I'd thought about it pretty carefully. It didn't hold up. The ink was gone, but I'd written the words, and I'd meant them when I wrote them. And the frequency had answered, and I'd understood the answer, and none of that stopped being true because the paper was ash. And anyway, the other reason to stay quiet was simpler. There was no version of this account that Taylor Ryan could do anything with. I'd sat on a dead frequency and heard a woman's voice read my handwriting back to me through hardware that hadn't existed since 2013. I'd written a false entry about a mountain lion, and the voice had read it. I'd written a conditional promise, and the voice had accepted it. I'd received coordinates for a fire 4 days before the fire happened, and the fire had happened exactly there. I destroyed the radio and burned the journal because the next future entry described me walking north into the tree line at 3 a.m. and not coming back. That's what I had. That was the account. I could say all of it out loud, and every word would be true, and it would sound like a man who had spent 3 weeks alone at high altitude and lost his grip on something important. Maybe that's what it was. I'd considered that too, up in the tower, seriously considered it, and I'd kept coming back to the fire on the northwest face of Daughter of the Sun Mountain, the exact coordinates, the exact time, the strike hitting exactly where the voice had said it would 4 days before it happened. Zayden Fisher's voice on the radio confirming containment. That had been real. I had the log entry to prove it, or I'd had it until I burned the log. So, no account to give. Promise to keep. Same outcome either way. Spencer pulled into the Sealy Lake District Office parking lot and cut the engine, and we sat there for a second in the quiet. "Get some sleep tonight," he said. "Yeah," I said. I got out and got my duffel from the back, and Spencer got the canvas bag with the radio pieces, and we went inside, and I gave Madeline Solomon a look that I hoped communicated something like, "I'm fine," without requiring me to say it, and she gave me a look back that communicated she'd decide that for herself in her own time. The Swan Range was gone from view. The frequency was silent. Whatever had been reading the pages had nothing left to read, and I was standing in a district office in Sealy Lake with a duffel bag and a fine coming and 6 weeks of empty ridgelines behind me, and that was the end of it. That was all of it.